Lie, Trust Betrayal. Welcome to Cafe Tales. I'm your host, Ailey, and I want to begin by saying how truly grateful I am for each of you who chooses to spend your time here. It warms my heart to know that these stories bring comfort and joy to such a wonderful community of listeners. Preparing every mystery takes time and care, but seeing how much you enjoy them makes it all worthwhile. It means the world to me that our little community continues to grow, and I'm delighted that so many of you are part of it. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing. It helps our channel grow and allows us to bring you even more stories to enjoy together. Chapter 1. Bells in the Box. The Parish. Rooms of St. Mary Mead wore their finest evening dress that April evening in 1955, though the effect was rather like an elderly lady attempting to recapture her youth with too much powder and rouge. Bunting in faded red, white, and blue looped from corner to corner, and someone had made an ambitious attempt at festivity with fairy lights that hung in graceful swags along the decorations, though they remained stubbornly dark against the yellow glow of the overhead bulbs. Miss Jane Marple adjusted her gray shawl and settled into her usual seat in the third row, her keen blue eyes taking in the familiar scene with quiet interest. These trust meetings were always rather theatrical affairs, she reflected, watching the small drama of preparation unfold on the makeshift dais at the front of the room. "Quite a turnout tonight," observed Lady Bantry, lowering herself into the chair beside her old friend with a rustle of silk. Dolly Bantry's idea of appropriate dress for a parish meeting ran to emerald green taffeta and rather too many diamonds, but her heart was in the right place. Arthur promises revelations about the almshouse roof fund. Should be interesting. "Indeed," murmured Miss Marple, though her attention had wandered to the careful arrangements on the platform. A long table covered in green baize dominated the space, with 3 chairs positioned behind it. To the right stood a brass raffle drum, its polished surface gleaming under the lights, a small wooden crank handle protruding from its side like a ship's wheel in miniature. Arthur Penrith, the trust treasurer, bustled about the platform with the self-important air of a man who enjoyed being the center of attention. He was a smooth-faced fellow in his 50s, with thinning hair carefully combed over his scalp and an expensive suit that proclaimed his prosperity. In his hands he carried a brown leather document box, which he placed with ceremonial precision at his appointed place. "Ladies and gentlemen," he called out, his voice carrying easily across the room, "if you would take your seats, we shall begin promptly at 8 taels. I have promised you a truthful statement tonight, and a truthful statement you shall have." He patted the brown box affectionately, as though it contained the crown jewels rather than parish accounts. Miss Marple's gaze shifted to the other figures on the platform. Iris Lane, the honorary secretary, moved with the brisk efficiency of a woman accustomed to making things happen. She was perhaps 40, with iron-gray hair pinned into a severe chignon, and a tailored navy suit that spoke of good quality and careful maintenance. Her hands, Miss Marple noticed, were particularly neat, the nails filed short and practical, the fingers quick and precise as they arranged papers and adjusted the position of a small brass bell used to call for order. "Mrs. Lane keeps everything shipshape," Dolly murmured approvingly. "Couldn't manage without her, really. She has the keys to everything, organizes all the decorations, even types up the minutes so they're perfectly legible, most efficient." The third member of the evening's cast was making his way onto the platform now, a young man with a slightly grubby appearance of someone who worked with his hands, Victor. Dale touched his cap respectfully to Mrs. Lane, before checking something behind the curtains at the back of the stage. "That's the electrician," Dolly explained in an undertone. "Young Dale. He manages the lighting for all our functions. Clever with wires and such things, though he does leave them lying about rather carelessly sometimes." A hearty laugh boomed across the room as Paul Cartwright, The landlord of the Hare and Lantern made his entrance. He was a large, jovial man with a red face and hands like ham joints, the sort of publican who believed that louder was always better when it came to showing enthusiasm. "Evening, Arthur," he called out. "Ready for the big draw, are we?" "Nothing like a good raffle to get the blood flowing," Mr. Penrith smiled thinly. "Indeed, Paul. Though I fancy tonight's revelations may prove more stimulating than any raffle." Miss Marple caught the slight edge in the treasurer's voice and filed it away in the orderly compartments of her mind. In her long experience, when people spoke of revelations at parish meetings, someone was usually about to be made very uncomfortable indeed. The room continued to fill with the usual collection of St. Mary Mead worthies. The Reverend Leonard Clement took his place in the front row beside his wife Griselda, who was making a valiant attempt to look suitably serious, despite her natural inclination toward frivolity. Dr. Haydock settled his considerable bulk into a reinforced chair near the back, close enough to make a quick exit if the proceedings grew too tedious. At precisely 8 Mrs. Lane rang her little brass bell with 3 crisp notes. The murmur of conversation died away as Arthur Penrith rose to his feet, one hand resting possessively on his document box. "Friends and neighbors," he began, his voice taking on the slightly pompous tone that public speaking seemed to inspire in otherwise reasonable men. "We gather tonight for the quarterly presentation of the St. Mary Mead Trust accounts. As you know, our primary concern at present is the urgent matter of repairs to the almshouse roof." A ripple of polite attention passed through the audience. The almshouse roof had been a topic of parochial conversation for the better part of 6 months. "Before we proceed to the formal business," Penrith continued, "I believe tradition demands we hold our little raffle. Mrs. Lane has prepared tickets, and the proceeds will naturally go toward our roofing fund." He moved toward the brass drum with evident pleasure, placing one manicured hand on the wooden crank. The raffle tickets had already been deposited inside. Miss Marple could hear them rustling like autumn leaves as Penrith gave the drum an experimental turn. "I'm sorry the fairy lights aren't working," Mrs. Lane called out from her position behind the table. "They're temporarily out of order, I'm afraid." "No matter," Penrith replied genially. "We have quite enough illumination for our purposes." Miss Marple found herself studying the arrangement more closely. There was something not quite right about the scene, though she couldn't immediately put her finger on what it might be. The bunting hung in neat swags, the fairy lights draped artfully among the folds despite their lack of function. The brass drum gleamed, the green baize table covering lay smooth and unrumpled. And yet— "Now then," Arthur Penrith announced, grasping the crank handle firmly, "let us see who fortune favors tonight. The winning ticket will receive Mrs. Weatherby's excellent fruitcake, donated most generously for our cause." He began to turn the handle with theatrical deliberation. The drum rotated slowly. The tickets rustled inside like small creatures disturbed from sleep. Penrith's face wore the expression of benevolent authority that he clearly relished, his eyes bright with anticipation of the revelations to come. "The winning ticket is—" he began, then stopped abruptly. His hand still gripping the crank seemed to convulse. His face went very pale, then flushed an alarming shade of red. A strange, strangled sound escaped his lips, not quite a gasp, not quite a cry. "Arthur!" Mrs. Lane started forward, but it was too late. The treasurer of the St. Mary Mead Village Trust collapsed beside his brass drum, his hands still clutching the wooden handle, his brown document box tumbling to the floor with a sound like thunder in the suddenly silent room. Chapter 2. A Death on the Dais. The silence that followed Arthur Penrith's collapse lasted perhaps 3 seconds, though to Miss Marple it seemed to stretch into eternity. Then pandemonium erupted as chairs scraped back and voices rose in a cacophony of alarm and confusion. "Stand back, everyone!" Dr. Haydock's authoritative voice cut through the chaos as his substantial form pushed through the crowd gathering around the fallen treasurer. "Give the man air." Miss Marple remained in her seat, her sharp eyes taking in every detail as the scene unfolded. While others rushed forward in well-meaning confusion, she had learned long ago that observation was often more valuable than action in such moments. Dr. Haydock knelt beside Arthur Penrith's motionless form, his practiced hands moving swiftly to check for signs of life. The treasurer lay on his side, one arm flung out toward the brass drum, his face an unhealthy grayish color that spoke eloquently of his condition. "Is he—" Griselda Clement's voice trailed off, unable to complete the dreadful question. "I'm afraid so," Dr. Haydock said quietly, sitting back on his heels. "Poor fellow's gone." A collective gasp arose from the assembled villagers. Mrs. Lane stood frozen behind the green baize table, her usually composed features slack with shock. Young Victor Dale had emerged from behind the curtains and stood gaping at the scene, his hands still grimy from whatever electrical work he'd been attending to. "Heart attack, would you say?" Paul Cartwright's booming voice had dropped to an uncharacteristic whisper. "Always said Arthur worked too hard. All that worry over figures and such." Dr. Haydock frowned, his fingers hovering over something that had caught his attention. Miss Marple's keen eyesight picked out a tiny mark on Arthur's palm, a small darkened spot that might have been a burn. "Could be the heart," he murmured, though his tone suggested uncertainty. "Though there's something." He leaned closer, his nose wrinkling slightly. Odd smell, rather like ozone. Before anyone could respond, the authoritative tread of official boots announced the arrival of Inspector Slack. The inspector had been enjoying his evening pint at the Hare and Lantern when young Tom Fletcher had burst in with news of the catastrophe. "Right then," Slack announced, surveying the scene with the grim satisfaction of a man whose pessimistic view of parish gatherings had been thoroughly vindicated. "Nobody move. This is now a potential crime scene." "Crime scene?" Paul Cartwright's voice climbed toward its normal volume. "What crime?" "Poor Arthur's had a heart attack during the raffle draw." "Excitement of it all, I shouldn't wonder." Inspector Slack's expression suggested he had little patience for such simplistic explanations. "That's as may be, Mr. Cartwright. But until I'm satisfied as to the cause of death, nobody leaves this room. And nobody touches anything." Miss Marple watched approvingly as the inspector began his systematic examination of the platform. Whatever his other failings, Slack was thorough when circumstances demanded it. The brass drum stood exactly where it had been positioned for the evening, innocent and gleaming under the harsh electric light. The wooden crank protruded at the same angle, though Arthur's hand had finally released its desperate grip. Miss Marple noticed that Slack was careful not to touch the handle directly, using his handkerchief to turn it experimentally. "Seems ordinary enough," he muttered, peering at the mechanism. The tickets rustled inside like dry leaves, their cheerful colors a grotesque contrast to the tragedy that had unfolded. Slack's attention turned to the electrical arrangements that served the platform. A plug board had been mounted on the side wall, its collection of switches and sockets looking serviceable if unexciting. Thick electrical cables ran from it to various points around the room, providing power for the overhead lights that bathed everything in their unforgiving glare. "The fairy lights," Mrs. Lane said suddenly, her voice slightly unsteady. "They've been out of order for some time. Mr. Dale was supposed to repair them, but left everything unplugged except the main hall lights." Victor Dale interjected quickly. His young face was pale with shock and perhaps something else, the fear of being held responsible for whatever had occurred. "Checked everything myself before the meeting started. Nothing else was connected." "I swear it," Inspector Slack made a note in his book, his pencil scratching loudly in the tense silence. Miss Marple observed that his examination of the platform was revealing several interesting details. The table legs, she noticed, rested upon a thin coconut matting that had been placed over the polished linoleum floor. It was the sort of practical measure one might take to prevent furniture from sliding, though it struck her as unusual for such a temporary arrangement. Mrs. Lane, recovering some of her customary efficiency, approached Inspector Slack with a neat folder in her hands. "Inspector, you'll want to see these, tonight's agenda and the minutes from our last meeting. I always prepare clean-typed copies for clarity." Slack accepted the documents with a grunt of acknowledgement. Miss Marple, straining her ears, caught Mrs. Lane's quiet addition. Everything was in perfect order. Arthur was quite particular about such things. Indeed, he had been, Miss Marple reflected. Arthur Penrith had been known throughout St. Mary Mead for his meticulous attention to detail, particularly where money was concerned. It seemed tragically appropriate that he should have met his end during what promised to be his most important financial presentation. As Inspector Slack continued his methodical examination, Miss Marple found herself drawn to study the scene from her position in the third row. Something about the arrangement on the platform continued to trouble her, though she could not immediately identify what it might be. Rising quietly from her chair, she made her way closer to the dais, careful to avoid Inspector Slack's disapproving gaze. The green baize covering on the table was smooth and unrumpled. The brass drum was positioned precisely as it had been for the evening's festivities. Yet there was something erratic, she murmured. "A word, if you please?" She moved to where he still knelt beside Arthur's body, noting the careful way he avoided touching the deceased man's right hand. "There's a mark," he said quietly, "on his palm. Looks rather like a burn, though I can't imagine how he might have acquired it from that brass drum." Miss Marple bent closer, her aged eyes still sharp enough to discern the small dark mark the doctor indicated. It was indeed suggestive of a burn, though of a peculiar sort, more like the mark left by a very brief but intense heat. As she straightened, her hand brushed against the bunting that hung so decoratively along the front edge of the platform. Something pricked her finger, not sharply, but with a subtle sting, like a very fine needle. "Oh," she exclaimed softly, examining her fingertip. "What is it, Miss Marple?" Dr. Haydock asked. She was already running her fingers along the hem of the bunting, feeling for whatever had caused the slight injury. There, embedded in the fold of the fabric, almost invisible unless one was specifically searching for it, was what felt like a strand of very fine wire. "How curious," she murmured, though she was careful not to disturb whatever she had discovered. Standing by the dais, Miss Marple allowed her gaze to wander over the scene once more. The coconut matting beneath the table legs showed a faint dampness at its edges, as though it had recently been cleaned. The air still held that faint ozone smell Dr. Haydock had noticed, reminiscent of electrical equipment that had been recently used. Most curious of all was the brass drum itself, such an innocent object designed for nothing more sinister than the drawing of raffle tickets. Yet Arthur Penrith lay dead beside it, his hand bearing what appeared to be an electrical burn in a room where young Victor Dale swore nothing was connected to the mains except the overhead lighting. Miss Marple's fingers found her knitting needles, a sure sign that her mind was beginning to work in those careful, methodical patterns that had served her so well in the past. In her experience, when something appeared impossible, it usually meant that one was not asking the right questions. The question that seemed most pressing at the moment was this: how does a man receive an electrical burn from a brass raffle drum in a room where nothing electrical was supposed to be functioning? She had a suspicion that the answer, when it came, would prove to be both simpler and more ingenious than anyone present might imagine. Chapter 3. Salt on the Eye. Floor. The cupboard beneath the platform stairs was a monument to Mrs. Tripp's devotion to cleanliness. Every mop hung in its designated place. Each bottle of cleaning fluid stood in regimented rows, and the collection of polishing cloths was folded with military precision. Mrs. Tripp herself stood guard over her domain like a small, fierce dragon, her weathered hands clasped tightly before her starched apron. 37 years I've been cleaning these rooms, she declared to Inspector Slack, her voice carrying the authority of long service. Never had so much as a complaint about my work. Not from the Reverend or anyone else. Miss Marple, who had quietly attached herself to the inspector's examination, watched Mrs. Tripp with considerable interest. The charwoman was clearly distressed, though whether from Arthur Penrith's death or from some disruption to her usual routine remained to be determined. "I'm sure your work is exemplary, Mrs. Tripp," Slack said with uncharacteristic patience. "We're simply trying to establish exactly what happened this evening." Mrs. Tripp sniffed, her sharp nose twitching as she surveyed the platform with evident disapproval. "Well, I can tell you one thing for certain, Inspector. There's salt on that floor where salt has no business being." "Salt?" "Right there by the table legs." Mrs. Tripp pointed with one gnarled finger. "I never use salt for cleaning. Leaves a terrible bloom on the linoleum." "It does. Mrs. Weatherby tried to tell me once that salt was good for bringing up the shine, but I told her straight. Soap and elbow grease, that's what gets floors clean." Miss Marple followed Mrs. Tripp's pointing finger and observed the faint crystalline residue that dusted the edges of the coconut matting. In the harsh electric light, the tiny particles glittered like frost on a winter morning. "When did you last clean this area, Mrs. Tripp?" she asked gently. "Yesterday afternoon, same as always before a meeting. Swept, mopped, and polished until you could see your face in that linoleum." Mrs. Tripp's tone suggested that anyone who questioned her thoroughness did so at their peril. "Came back this morning just to check, and everything was exactly as I left it." Inspector Slack had produced a magnifying glass from somewhere about his person and was examining the suspicious residue with professional interest. "Certainly looks like salt," he muttered. "But why would anyone scatter salt about the platform?" Mrs. Tripp bustled over to peer at her beloved linoleum more closely. "That's not all that's wrong," she announced with grim satisfaction. "That mop pail by the stage isn't one of mine." She gestured toward a galvanized bucket that sat inconspicuously in the shadow of the platform. Miss Marple had noticed it earlier, but had assumed it belonged to the usual collection of cleaning equipment. "Mine are all enameled blue," Mrs. Tripp continued. "Have for 15 years. Never owned a galvanized pail in my life. Nasty things. They rust something dreadful." Slack approached the offending bucket with caution, as though it might contain something more dangerous than cleaning water. When he bent to examine it, his nose wrinkled in evident distaste. "Smells peculiar," he observed. "Not like ordinary cleaning water." Miss Marple joined him beside the bucket, her own sensitive nose detecting the faint but unmistakable odor of washing soda mixed with something else. Something that reminded her strongly of the residue they had found on the platform. "Salt water," she said quietly. "Mixed with soda, I should think. But what would anyone want with salt water?" Slack demanded, his frustration beginning to show. Before anyone could offer a theory, Dr. Haydock's voice called from the platform where he was conducting his preliminary examination of the deceased. "Inspector, you might want to see this." They returned to find the doctor kneeling beside Arthur Penrith's body, having carefully removed the man's black Oxford shoes. The leather soles, normally pristine given Arthur's fastidious nature, were discolored with the same crystalline residue they had observed on the platform floor. "Salt," Dr. Haydock confirmed, scraping a small sample onto his handkerchief. "Quite a lot of it, ground into the leather as though he'd been standing in the stuff." Miss Marple examined the soles of the shoes with considerable interest. The salt had been pressed deep into the leather, creating a distinctive pattern that spoke of prolonged contact with the substance. He was standing in it when he died, she observed thoughtfully. Standing in salt water, I should imagine. But that's impossible, Mrs. Lane interjected from her position behind the table. She had remained remarkably composed throughout the evening's proceedings, her neat gray hair still perfectly arranged despite the shock of Arthur's collapse. The floor was perfectly clean when I arrived to set up the decorations. I would have noticed anything amiss. When exactly did you arrive this evening? Inspector Slack asked, his notebook at the ready. 6, Mrs. Lane replied promptly. I always come early to ensure everything is properly arranged. The bunting needed to be hung, the raffle drum positioned, and the table prepared for Arthur's presentation. And the floor was dry then, completely. Mrs. Tripp's work is always impeccable. The compliment was delivered with the brisk efficiency that characterized all of Mrs. Lane's utterances. Miss Marple found herself studying the area around the table legs more closely. The coconut matting showed distinct signs of recent dampness, with darker patches that suggested it had absorbed a considerable amount of liquid. More intriguingly, the dampness seemed to follow a particular pattern, not the random spill one might expect from an accident, but something more deliberate. A tide mark, she murmured to herself, tracing the faint line with her eyes. What's that, Miss Marple? Dr. Haydock inquired. The dampness, Doctor. See how it forms a rough circle around the table? Almost as though someone had deliberately moistened the floor in that particular area. Inspector Slack crouched down to examine the pattern Miss Marple had identified. The faint discoloration of the linoleum was indeed suggestive of water that had been allowed to dry naturally, leaving behind the telltale marks of its former presence. You're right, he admitted grudgingly. Looks deliberate to me, but I still don't understand why anyone would want to wet down the floor with salt water. Miss Marple's fingers had found her knitting needles again, clicking them together in the gentle rhythm that accompanied her deepest thinking. Salt water, she mused, was an excellent conductor of electricity. Every village child learned that much from elementary science lessons. Combined with a mysterious wire she had discovered in the bunting and the electrical burn on Arthur's palm, the picture was beginning to form a most disturbing pattern. Inspector, she said carefully, I wonder if you might examine the electrical arrangements more closely, particularly anything that might have been connected to the platform area. Slack looked skeptical. Young Dale swore nothing was plugged in except the main lights. Nevertheless, Miss Marple persisted gently. I have a feeling that electricity may prove to be the key to our puzzle. As if summoned by her words, Victor Dale emerged from behind the curtains, where he had been conducting his own nervous examination of the wiring. His youthful face was pale with anxiety, and his hands shook slightly as he approached the group around Arthur's body. Inspector, I said hesitantly, there's something you should know. When I was checking the connections earlier, I found one of the fairy light plugs had been moved. Not connected to anything, mind you, but it wasn't where I left it yesterday. Moved how? Someone had shifted it from the main board to one of the side outlets. Didn't think much of it at the time. These old buildings, plugs get knocked about. But now, with Mr. Penrith dead and all... His voice trailed off as the implications of his discovery began to penetrate his consciousness. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. In her long experience, the smallest details often proved to be the most significant. A moved plug, a bucket that didn't belong, salt where none should be. Individually, they might mean nothing. Taken together, they suggested a mind capable of considerable planning and attention to detail. A very domestic sort of murder, she murmured to herself, though quietly enough that only Lady Bantry, hovering anxiously nearby, could hear. What was that, Jane? Dolly whispered. Oh, nothing important, dear, Miss Marple replied with a gentle smile. I was merely observing that some of the most ingenious crimes are those that use the most ordinary materials. salt water, and electricity. Three common substances that became something far more dangerous when combined with knowledge and murderous intent. The question now was, who in St. Mary Mead possessed both the knowledge and the motive to transform a simple parish meeting into the scene of a carefully orchestrated murder? Chapter 4. Wire in the Bunting. Miss Marple's discovery of the fine wire embedded in the bunting had been nagging at her consciousness, like a persistent itch that demanded attention. While Inspector Slack continued his methodical examination of the platform, she found herself drawn back to the decorative fabric that hung so innocently along the front edge of the stage. The bunting itself was unremarkable. The same red, white, and blue triangular flags that graced every parish celebration, from harvest festivals to coronation parties. Mrs. Lane had arranged it with her characteristic attention to detail, creating graceful swags that gave the austere parish rooms a festive air despite the darkness of the fairy lights above. Working, with the delicate touch that came naturally, to a woman who had spent decades manipulating, knitting wool and embroidery silk, Miss Marple began to trace the hidden wire with her fingertips. It ran through the hem of the bunting like a secret message written in a language only she could decipher. Find something interesting, Miss Marple? Dr. Haydock had abandoned his examination of the deceased and was watching her exploration with professional curiosity. Perhaps, she replied carefully, not wishing to voice premature theories. This wire appears to be quite deliberate in its placement. The strand was remarkably fine, much thinner than ordinary household electrical cable. Miss Marple's educated guess, based on years of listening to her nephew Raymond's enthusiastic descriptions of wireless sets and their construction, was that it resembled the sort of enameled copper wire used in radio coils. Following the wire's path with gentle fingers, she traced it behind the raffle table where it disappeared from view. The construction was ingenious in its simplicity. The wire had been carefully stitched into the bunting's hem, invisible to casual observation, but perfectly positioned to serve some hidden purpose. "Inspector Slack," she called softly. "I believe you should examine this." The inspector approached with his customary skepticism, though recent experience had taught him not to dismiss Miss Marple's observations entirely. When she showed him the concealed wire, his expression sharpened with professional interest. "Definitely not standard electrical cable," he muttered, producing his magnifying glass once again. "Too fine by half. What would someone want with wire like this?" Miss Marple had moved to the back of the platform, following the wire's hidden trajectory. Here, away from the main focus of activity, she made another significant discovery. The wire emerged from the bunting and ran down the back leg of the raffle table, where it had been wound once around the brass crank spindle and secured beneath the adjustment nut with almost surgical precision. "Ingenious," she murmured admiringly, despite the sinister implications of her discovery. The other end of the wire had been led along the table leg to the floor, where it disappeared beneath the platform's edge toward the wall where the old radiator stood. Miss Marple knelt with some difficulty, her aged joints protesting, and peered into the dusty space beneath the stage. There, barely visible in the shadows, the wire terminated at the radiator valve. Someone had used a twist of what appeared to be green florist's wire to secure the copper strand to the metal fitting, creating a connection that would be virtually invisible unless one knew exactly where to look. "Most interesting indeed," she said to herself, though her voice carried clearly enough for Inspector Slack to hear. "What have you found now?" he demanded, joining her beside the radiator. Miss Marple indicated the junction where the hidden wire met the heating system. Even in the poor light, the green verdigris on the florist's wire was clearly visible, the telltale mark of copper, corrosion that spoke of recent exposure to moisture and electrical current. "A complete circuit," she explained patiently. "From the radiator through this concealed wire to the brass crank of the raffle drum. Slack stared at the arrangement with dawning comprehension. You mean someone deliberately? I mean, Inspector, that poor Arthur Penrith was electrocuted. The current traveled from the electrical supply through this wire to the brass crank. When he grasped the handle with his damp palm, the circuit was completed through his body to the wet floor and then to the radiator system. Dr. Haydock had joined them now, his medical knowledge filling in the gaps of Miss Marple's explanation. The salt water would have made an excellent conductor, he observed grimly, enhanced the electrical contact through his shoes. No wonder there was that ozone smell and the burn mark on his palm. Inspector Slack was examining the radiator connection more closely, his policeman's mind already working through the implications. This florist's wire, green stuff like this, is common enough. Every flower shop in the county stocks it. Indeed, Miss Marple agreed, though I suspect our murderer didn't need to venture as far as the county town to acquire it. She had been thinking about the practical requirements of such an elaborate scheme. The killer would have needed access to the parish rooms, knowledge of electrical principles, and familiarity with the evening's arrangements. Most importantly, they would have required the opportunity to prepare the scene without interruption. Mrs. Lane, she called gently to the secretary, who was still maintaining her vigil behind the green baize table. I wonder if you might tell us about the preparation of the decorations. Iris Lane approached with her characteristic brisk efficiency, though Miss Marple noticed that her usual composure showed signs of strain. The events of the evening had clearly shaken her more than she cared to admit. I always handle the decorations myself, she replied promptly. The bunting was hung this afternoon around 3 o'clock. I like to ensure everything is properly arranged well before the event. And the raffle drum, when was that positioned? At the same time. Arthur was quite particular about its placement, insisted it be exactly 2 feet from the right edge of the table. Mrs. Lane's voice caught slightly on the treasurer's name. He was always so precise about such details. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. Arthur Penrith's reputation for exactitude was well known throughout St. Mary Mead. It seemed tragically ironic that his murderer had exploited that very precision to ensure he would be standing in exactly the right position when the fatal current was applied. The wirework is quite skillful, she observed, studying the junction at the radiator once more. Someone with experience in delicate handwork, I should imagine. Wireless repairs. Perhaps, suggested Dr. Haydock. This looks like the sort of wire they use in radio sets. Possibly, Miss Marple agreed, though her mind was already pursuing another line of thought. The careful stitching of the wire into the bunting hem spoke of someone accustomed to detailed needlework. The precise positioning of the drum, the methodical preparation of the saltwater solution, the timing that ensured Arthur would be alone at the crank when the current was applied, all of these elements suggested a mind that thought in terms of domestic organization rather than mechanical expertise. Inspector Slack had been examining the electrical supply arrangements with growing understanding of the murder method. Clever, he admitted grudgingly. Run a live wire from the mains to the crank handle. Complete the circuit through the victim and the wet floor back to the radiator earth. Simple as falling off a log once you know how it's done, though requiring considerable planning, Miss Marple pointed out. A murderer would have needed to ensure the floor was wetted at precisely the right time, that Arthur would be standing in the correct position, and that no one else would touch the crank handle before he did. The complexity of the scheme was beginning to reveal itself in all its calculated malevolence. This had not been a crime of passion or sudden opportunity, but rather a carefully orchestrated execution that had exploited both Arthur's predictable habits and the familiar routines of parish life. Someone in St. Mary Mead had spent considerable time and effort planning the perfect murder, using the most domestic of materials to create a death trap of shocking ingenuity. Chapter 5. Fairy Lights That Weren't. The revelation of the hidden wire had transformed Inspector Slack's investigation from a routine inquiry into a sudden death to the methodical unraveling of a premeditated murder. With grim determination, he began examining every aspect of the parish room's electrical arrangements, paying particular attention to the fairy lights that hung so decoratively but uselessly among the bunting. Victor Dale hovered nervously at the inspector's shoulder, his youthful face pale with the realization that his domain of switches and cables had been perverted into an instrument of death. "I swear the fairy lights have been dead for weeks," he repeated for the third time. "Took the plug away myself after Mrs. Weatherby complained they were flickering during the jumble sale." Miss Marple observed the young electrician with quiet interest. There was genuine distress in his manner, she noted. But whether it stemmed from professional embarrassment or something more sinister remained to be determined. "When exactly did you disconnect them?" Slack demanded, his notebook poised. "Must have been a fortnight ago, perhaps 3 weeks," Victor replied, running a grimy hand through his unruly hair. "The connections were getting dodgy. Old wiring, you see. I told Mrs. Lane we'd need new cable before they'd be safe to use again." "And where did you put the plug?" Victor gestured vaguely toward the electrical board. "Just left it loose on the mounting. Meant to take it away for repairs, but you know how it is." Other jobs came up. Inspector Slack examined the collection of plugs and switches with the intense concentration of a man who was beginning to understand that the solution to his case lay somewhere in the tangle of wires and connections. The fairy light plug was indeed present, sitting innocuously among the other electrical fittings. But its position struck him as somehow significant. Miss Marple had been conducting her own quiet investigation of the bunting wire, tracing its path with the methodical patience that had served her so well in previous mysteries. The wire itself was clearly not ordinary lamp cable, too fine and delicate for such mundane purposes. "Inspector," she said gently, "I believe we should examine Mrs. Lane's storage arrangements. Someone with access to the proper materials would have been essential for such an elaborate scheme." Mrs. Lane stiffened slightly at the suggestion, though her voice remained perfectly controlled. "Of course, Miss Marple. I have nothing to hide." She led them to a tall press that stood against the wall behind the platform, its wooden door secured with a substantial brass lock. From the chain around her waist, she produced a small key and opened the cabinet to reveal the organized chaos of parish administration. Shelves lined the interior, each bearing its burden of carefully labeled boxes and folders. Ledgers stood in neat rows, their leather spines marked with precise dates. Files of correspondence occupied one section, while cleaning supplies and maintenance equipment claimed another. "I keep all the hall materials here," Mrs. Lane explained with evident pride. "Keys, decorations, electrical supplies, everything needed for our various functions." Miss Marple's attention was immediately drawn to a wooden box labeled iFest Electrics in Mrs. Lane's unmistakably neat handwriting. Inside, she found exactly what she had expected to discover: a collection of paper labels with string attachments, a reel of thin florist's wire, a roll of black insulating tape, and tucked beneath these innocuous items, several inches of bare copper wire with freshly scraped ends. "How convenient," murmured Inspector Slack. Though his tone suggested anything but approval, Mrs. Lane's explanation was prompt and reasonable. "Mr. Dale left various bits and pieces about after the last electrical work. I simply gathered them up and stored them properly. One cannot have loose wires cluttering the premises." "Quite right," Miss Marple agreed mildly, though she was examining the copper wire with considerable interest. It was precisely the same gauge and type as the strand they had discovered in the bunting, enameled copper of the sort used in wireless construction, with a brown lacquer coating that identified it unmistakably. The ends had been scraped clean with what appeared to be a small knife or similar sharp instrument, exposing the bright metal beneath. Such careful preparation spoke of someone who understood the importance of good electrical connections. "This wire," she said carefully, "appears to have been prepared for use." "Does it?" Mrs. Lane's voice carried just a hint of defensive sharpness. "I'm sure I wouldn't know about such technical matters. I merely tidied up after Mr. Dale's work." Victor Dale had been examining the contents of the electrical box with growing puzzlement. "That's odd," he said slowly. "I don't remember leaving copper wire like that. The stuff I was working with was all modern cable, rubber insulation, much thicker than this old-fashioned type." Inspector Slack made another note, his pencil scratching ominously in the tense silence that followed. Miss Marple continued her examination of the key press, noting the meticulous organization that characterized every aspect of Mrs. Lane's administration. Paper labels were stacked with military precision, their edges perfectly aligned. The roll of insulating tape showed the neat diagonal cuts that spoke of careful usage rather than hasty tearing. Even the florist's wire was wound in tidy coils, each secured with a small twist to prevent tangling. "You're very well organized, Mrs. Lane," Miss Marple observed approvingly. "One must be in a position of responsibility," came the crisp reply. "The parish depends on proper administration." "Indeed it does," Miss Marple reflected. Though she was beginning to suspect that Mrs. Lane's organizational skills extended far beyond the usual duties of an honorary secretary, the careful preparation evident in the electrical box suggested a mind that planned ahead, anticipated needs, and prepared for contingencies. The fairy lights themselves hung in graceful swags above the bunting, their colored bulbs dark and lifeless. Miss Marple studied them with new understanding, recognizing them now as the perfect cover story for the presence of electrical wiring on the platform. Who would question the sight of wires and connections when decorative lighting was the obvious explanation? "Most ingenious," she murmured to herself, though quietly enough that only Lady Bantry could hear. "What's ingenious, Jane?" Dolly whispered. "The planning, my dear. Our murderer thought of everything. The cover story for the wiring, the materials carefully prepared in advance, even the timing to ensure the proper victim would be in exactly the right place." The complexity of the scheme was becoming more apparent with each revelation. This had not been a spontaneous crime, but rather a carefully choreographed performance in which every element had been positioned with mathematical precision. Someone in St. Mary Mead had spent weeks, perhaps months, planning Arthur Penrith's death with the same methodical attention to detail that characterized the best parish organization. The question that remained was, who possessed both the opportunity and the knowledge to execute such an elaborate murder? Miss Marple's fingers found her knitting needles once again, clicking them together in the gentle rhythm that accompanied her deepest thinking. The answer, she suspected, lay not in exotic expertise, but in the most mundane of domestic skills, the ability to organize, to plan ahead, and to execute complex tasks with quiet efficiency. In her experience, the most dangerous criminals were often those who appeared most respectable, most helpful, most indispensable to their communities. They were the people who held the keys, who knew everyone's business, who could move freely through familiar spaces without arousing the slightest suspicion. People exactly like the honorary secretary of the St. Mary Mead Trust. Chapter 6. Minutes. Typed twice. The Reverend Leonard Clement had arrived at the parish rooms with his usual collection of papers tucked under one arm, including what proved to be a carbon copy of the previous month's trust minutes. It was this seemingly innocuous document that provided Miss Marple with her next significant clue, though the revelation came about quite by accident. "I always keep copies of the parish records," the Reverend explained to Inspector Slack. producing a manila folder from his briefcase. One never knows when reference to previous decisions might prove necessary. Miss Marple, who'd been observing Mrs. Lane's increasingly strained composure, found herself drawn to examine the typewritten documents with her customary attention to detail. The minutes Mrs. Lane had prepared for the evening's meeting lay on the green baize table, crisp and professional in appearance. "May I?" she asked gently, indicating the Reverend's carbon copy. As she compared the two documents, her sharp eyes immediately detected a peculiarity in the typing. Both sets of minutes had been produced on the same machine. That much was evident from the distinctive characteristics that marked every typewriter as surely as fingerprints marked their human operators. "How interesting," she murmured, studying a particular letter that caught her attention. "Found something, Miss Marple?" Dr. Haydock inquired, abandoning his contemplation of the electrical arrangements to peer over her shoulder. "The letter E rides rather high on this typewriter," she observed, pointing to several examples in both documents. "See how it sits slightly above the line? Quite distinctive, really." Inspector Slack approached with his notebook ready, though he seemed puzzled by the significance of typewriter mechanics. "What of it?" Miss Marple continued her careful examination, comparing line by line the carbon copy from the Reverend's files with the fresh minutes Mrs. Lane had prepared for the evening's presentation. Most of the content was routine parish business: approvals of expenditures, reports on maintenance projects, the usual administrative minutiae that kept St. Mary Mead functioning smoothly. Then she found what she was looking for. "How very curious," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone that made Inspector Slack's attention sharpen immediately. "This paragraph appears in both documents, word for word." She indicated a section dealing with outstanding financial matters. "The treasurer reports satisfactory progress on all current projects, with particular attention to the Alms Roof Fund as previously discussed." "Perfectly ordinary," Mrs. Lane interjected quickly. "Standard wording for such matters." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed pleasantly, "except that tonight's agenda contains what appears to be a revision of this same paragraph." She examined the evening's typescript more closely. "The treasurer reports satisfactory progress on all current projects, with particular attention to the Almshouse Roof Fund. Treasurer to settle matter of Pabloan privately." The addition of that final sentence created a moment of tense silence in the parish rooms. Paul Cartwright, who had been maintaining a respectful quiet since Arthur's collapse, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "What pub loan?" Inspector Slack demanded, his policeman's instincts immediately alert to any mention of financial irregularities. Mrs. Lane's composed facade showed its first real crack. "I'm sure I wouldn't know," she said, though her voice lacked its usual conviction. "Arthur handled all the detailed financial arrangements." Miss Marple had been examining Arthur Penrith's jacket, which Dr. Haydock had carefully removed during his preliminary examination. In the breast pocket, she discovered a folded sheet of paper covered with the deceased man's handwriting, notes that appeared to have been prepared for his planned, truthful statement. The fee, handwritten draft made for illuminating reading. Arthur had clearly intended to make several serious accusations during his presentation to the trust. Chief among these was a charge of irregular handling of petty cash directed at Mrs. Lane, coupled with demands for a full accounting of various small expenditures over the past 6 months. Even more significantly, the notes referenced unsecured loan to Paul Cartwright, demand immediate repayment, and included a figure that made Inspector Slack whistle softly under his breath. 50, he muttered. Not exactly petty cash. Paul Cartwright's florid complexion had taken on an even deeper shade of red. "Now see here," he blustered. "Arthur and I had an understanding about that money. Purely temporary arrangement. It was business investment, nothing more." Nevertheless, Miss Marple observed gently, It appears that Mr. Penrith intended to make this temporary arrangement a matter of public record tonight. The implications were becoming clear. Arthur Penrith had planned to use the evening's meeting to expose what he perceived as financial irregularities within the trust. His truthful statement would have publicly embarrassed both Mrs. Lane and Paul Cartwright, demanding explanations they might have found difficult to provide. Lie, trust, betrayal, Miss Marple said softly, the words barely audible even to Lady Bantry. What was that, dear? Dolly whispered. Oh, merely reflecting on the nature of parish politics, Miss Marple replied with a slight smile. It seems Mr. Penrith intended quite a dramatic evening for all concerned. Inspector Slack was studying the evening's agenda with new understanding. The order of proceedings had been carefully arranged so that Arthur would be standing at the raffle drum, his hand on the brass crank, precisely when he began his prepared statement about financial matters. Who determined the order of tonight's agenda? He asked Mrs. Lane directly. I always prepare the agenda, she replied, though her usual brisk efficiency had been replaced by a noticeable tension. It's part of my secretarial duties. And you would have known about Mr. Penrith's intentions regarding these financial matters? Mrs. Lane hesitated for just a moment too long before answering. Arthur mentioned he planned to address certain administrative concerns. Yes, Miss Marple found herself studying the secretary with increasing interest. Mrs. Lane's role as keeper of keys, organizer of decorations, and preparer of agendas had given her complete control over the evening's arrangements. She had positioned the raffle drum, hung the bunting that concealed the fatal wire, and ensured that Arthur would be standing in exactly the right spot when the electrical trap was sprung. More than that, she had rewritten the order of battle. By controlling the agenda, she had transformed Arthur's planned public accusation into his death warrant, ensuring that his moment of intended triumph became the precise instant of his destruction. The typewriter evidence was particularly damning. The high-writing E that marked both documents proved that Mrs. Lane had access to Arthur's accusations well in advance of the meeting. She had known exactly what he planned to say, had understood the threat to her reputation and position, and had taken steps to ensure that his truthful statement would never be delivered. A most efficient solution to an awkward problem, Miss Marple murmured, though she was careful to keep her voice low enough that only her own ears could detect the words. The picture was becoming clearer with each revelation. This had been no crime of sudden passion, but rather a calculated response to a perceived threat. Someone had decided that Arthur Penrith's truthfulness was too dangerous to be permitted, and had taken elaborate steps to ensure his silence. The question that remained was whether Inspector Slack would recognize the significance of the evidence before him, or whether Miss Marple would need to guide his understanding more directly toward the uncomfortable truth about St. Mary, Mead's most trusted parish secretary. Chapter 7. A Radiator Bite. The old cast iron radiator that served the parish rooms had seen better days, its painted surface chipped and scarred by decades of faithful service. It stood against the back wall like a sleeping dragon, its pipes and valves extending into the shadows beneath the platform where few people ever ventured to look. Miss Marple, however, was not most people. Armed with Inspector Slack's electric torch and displaying a spryness that belied her years, she had made her way into the dusty space to examine the terminus of the hidden wire they had discovered in the bunting. What she found there confirmed her growing suspicions about the methodical nature of Arthur Penrith's murder. The radiator valve had been wrapped with a twist of green florist's wire. The bomb, same type they had discovered in Mrs. Lane's electrical supplies, but it was not the mere presence of the wire that caught Miss Marple's attention. It was the distinctive mark it had left on the metal fitting. "Inspector," she called softly. "You really must see this," Slack approached. with the weary air of a man who had already absorbed more technical details than his police training had prepared him. For when Miss Marple directed his attention to the valve, however, his expression sharpened with professional interest. The bite mark where the wire had been twisted tight was clearly visible, a distinctive pattern of scratches and gouges in the metal surface. More significantly, the beginnings of green verdigris had already begun to form around the contact point, the telltale sign of copper corrosion that occurred when electrical current passed through metal in the presence of moisture. That's recent, Dr. Haydock observed, having joined their examination. Verdigris takes time to develop, but not much time when there's current flowing. I'd say this was done within the last day or two. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. The evidence was building into an increasingly complete picture of premeditation and careful planning. Someone had prepared this electrical trap with considerable attention to detail, ensuring that every connection was secure and every element properly positioned. The florist's wire was an inspired choice, she remarked, studying the green strands that had been used to secure the connection. Strong enough to carry current, yet so commonplace that no one would think twice about seeing it in a parish hall. Inspector Slack was examining the radiator's position relative to the platform above. The cast iron construction provided an excellent earth connection for the electrical circuit, while the pipes that ran beneath the floor offered a hidden pathway for the deadly current to complete its journey. Like a giant kettle element, he muttered, beginning to understand the elegant simplicity of the murder method. Current flows from the mains through that hidden wire to the brass crank, then through the victim to the wet floor and back to earth through the radiator. Precisely, Miss Marple agreed, though I suspect our murderer would describe it in more domestic terms. After all, most households have learned to be wary of handling electrical appliances with wet hands near metal sinks. The parallel was uncomfortably apt. Arthur Penrith had been killed by the same principle that made it dangerous to operate a faulty electric kettle while standing on a damp kitchen floor, a lesson that every careful housewife learned through bitter experience or wise instruction. Returning to the main floor of the parish rooms, Miss Marple found her attention drawn once again to the electrical arrangements that had made the murder possible. The plug board mounted on the side wall appeared innocent enough, its collection of switches and sockets serving the routine needs of parish functions, but tucked innocuously. Among the standard fittings was a 2-pin adapter that she had not noticed during their earlier examination. It sat there with the casual anonymity of a piece of equipment that belonged to the room's normal electrical supplies, yet something about its placement struck her as significant. "This adapter," she said to Inspector Slack, indicating the small device, "was it part of the original electrical installation?" Victor Dale examined the item with the expertise of someone familiar with every wire and fitting in the building. "Can't say I've seen it before," he admitted. "Not the sort of thing we'd normally need for the whole lighting." Miss Marple studied the adapter's position more carefully. It was connected to one of the wall sockets, but nothing was plugged into it. At least, nothing was plugged into it now. The device's presence suggested that it had been installed to serve a specific purpose, most likely to provide the electrical connection needed for the hidden wire system. "The fairy lights were the perfect cover story," she observed to Lady Bantry, who had been following the technical discussions with growing bewilderment. Anyone seeing electrical work being done would assume it was related to the decorative lighting. The complexity of the murder plot was becoming more impressive with each revelation. The killer had not only devised an ingenious method of electrocution, but had also created a comprehensive cover story that would deflect suspicion from the true purpose of their electrical preparations. Every element had been carefully considered and positioned. The bunting provided concealment for the wire. The fairy lights explained the presence of electrical equipment. The salt water enhanced the conductivity of the circuit. The radiator provided the earth connection that completed the deadly pathway. Most tellingly, the timing had been orchestrated with mathematical precision. Arthur Penrith had been maneuvered into position at the exact moment when his planned accusations would have been most damaging to his killer. Instead of delivering his truthful statement, he had become the victim of someone else's calculated response to the threat he represented. It required considerable advanced knowledge, Miss Marple mused, her fingers working automatically with her knitting needles. Not just of electrical principles, but of Arthur's intentions, the evening's agenda, and the physical arrangements of the parish rooms. Inspector Slack was beginning to appreciate the full scope of the crime they were investigating. This was not a simple murder, but rather an elaborate performance in which every prop had been positioned and every cue carefully timed. Someone who had access to everything, he said slowly. Keys to the building, knowledge of the evening's plans, familiarity with the electrical systems, Miss Marple added meaningfully, and the domestic skills necessary to execute such delicate work. The wire was stitched into the bunting with considerable expertise, she continued. The connections were made with professional precision, and the timing was coordinated with the sort of attention to detail that characterizes the best household management. The parallels were becoming uncomfortably clear. The same organizational abilities that made someone an excellent parish secretary would also serve them well in planning and executing the perfect murder. The skills were remarkably similar: attention to detail, advanced planning, and the ability to coordinate multiple elements into a seamless whole. As Miss Marple surveyed the scene once more, she reflected on the irony of Arthur Penrith's situation. He had planned to expose what he saw as betrayals of trust within the parish organization, only to become the victim of an even greater betrayal by someone he had trusted implicitly. The murderer had turned the very foundations of parish life, cooperation, trust, and shared responsibility into weapons for destroying the man who threatened to expose their deceptions. It was, she concluded, a most domestic sort of murder indeed. Chapter 8. Shoes, Sweat, and a ring. Dr. Haydock's medical examination of Arthur Penrith's remains was conducted with the methodical precision that had served him well through 4 decades of country practice. What he discovered confirmed the electrical nature of the death, while revealing additional details that painted an increasingly complete picture of the murder method. The burn mark on his palm is quite distinctive, he reported to Inspector Slack, indicating the small darkened area that had first caught his attention. Consistent with electrical contact, though the current must have been relatively brief. A longer exposure would have caused more extensive tissue damage. Miss Marple observed the examination with quiet interest, noting the way the burn mark followed the contours of Arthur's grip on the brass crank handle. The pattern suggested that he had been grasping the metal firmly when the current struck, his hand locked in position by the electrical shock until his muscles released him into unconsciousness and death. The signet ring shows similar marking, Dr. Haydock continued, pointing to a discolored area along the edge of Arthur's heavy gold ring. Metal conducts electricity particularly well? Of course, Miss Marple murmured. The current would have concentrated at any point of metal contact. Inspector Slack made careful notes while Dr. Haydock completed his preliminary findings. The electrical burns provided incontrovertible proof that Arthur had been electrocuted, though the relatively minor extent of the damage suggested a sophisticated understanding of exactly how much current would be needed to stop a man's heart without creating obvious signs of electrical injury. Someone who understood the precise requirements, Miss Marple murmured to herself, though her words carried clearly in the hushed atmosphere of the parish rooms. The examination of Arthur's shoes proved equally revealing. The black Oxfords that had been his pride, always perfectly polished and maintained with the care of a man who believed that appearances mattered, now told a story of his final moments that was both tragic and illuminating. Dr. Haydock had already noted the salt crystals ground into the leather soles, but a closer examination revealed additional evidence of the murderous preparation. The dampness that still clung to the shoes was not ordinary water, but rather the same salt and soda solution they had discovered in the mysterious galvanized bucket. The conductivity would have been excellent, Dr. Haydock observed with clinical detachment. Salt water provides a much better electrical pathway than ordinary moisture. Combined with the perspiration from his hands, it would have created ideal conditions for electrical shock. Miss Marple reflected on the grim efficiency of the arrangement. Arthur's own nervous perspiration, combined with a carefully prepared salt solution on the floor, had transformed his body into the final link in a deadly electrical circuit. The killer had exploited the very human responses, sweaty palms, damp feet, that might have been expected from a man about to make serious public accusations. Most thorough planning, she observed to Lady Bantry, who had been maintaining her vigil with the stoic determination of a true friend. The question of who had been responsible for the floor, preparation was becoming increasingly important. Mrs. Tripp had been adamant that she had not cleaned the platform area that evening, yet someone had clearly taken considerable trouble to ensure that the linoleum around the raffle table was properly moistened with the conductive solution. Mrs. Lane mentioned helping with the cleaning. Inspector Slack said, consulting his notes. She said she'd swabbed the dais because Mrs. Tripp had already gone home. This helpful gesture, which might have seemed like typical parish volunteerism, now took on a far more sinister significance. Mrs. Lane's assistants had provided the perfect opportunity to prepare the deadly trap without arousing suspicion from anyone who might have observed her activities. Victor? Dale's alibi was holding up under scrutiny. The football supper at the Hare and Lantern had been well attended, with half the pub's regular customers ready to vouch for his presence throughout the evening. More importantly, his professional assessment of the wirework suggested that whoever had prepared the electrical trap possessed skills rather different from those of a qualified electrician. Silly, thin stuff for man's work, he had called the enameled copper wire, shaking his head at what he clearly considered amateur foolishness. Anyone who knew proper electrical work would never use wireless coil wire for carrying mains current. Dangerous? That is. Yet the wire had served its murderous purpose perfectly, suggesting that the killer's knowledge came from sources other than formal electrical training. Miss Marple found herself thinking of the many domestic situations in which people learn to handle small electrical repairs, mending wireless sets, replacing lamp fittings, dealing with the minor electrical problems that arose in well-run households. Paul Cartwright's protestations of innocence were growing louder and more elaborate as the investigation progressed. The publican's bluff manner and obvious distress at Arthur's death seemed genuine enough, though his financial difficulties provided a clear motive for wishing the treasurer's accusations to remain unspoken. Arthur was a hard man with money, he admitted when pressed by Inspector Slack. But fair, mind you. We had an understanding about repayment terms. No need for all this public washing of dirty linen. Yet Arthur's handwritten note suggested a rather different interpretation of their understanding. The demand for immediate repayment, coupled with threats to make the matter public, indicated that the treasurer had intended to use the evening's meeting to apply maximum pressure on his debtor. Miss Marple studied Cartwright's hands as he gesticulated his way through another protestation of innocence. They were large, capable hands marked by years of manual work, drawing pints, moving barrels, handling the countless heavy objects that filled a publican's daily routine, but they showed none of the delicate skill that would have been required for the intricate wire work they had discovered. Beer stone and sausage fat, she murmured. remembering a phrase from the outline she carried in her memory. These were hands shaped by practical labor, not by the fine needlework and precise manipulation that had characterized the bunting preparation. The contrast with Mrs. Lane's hands could hardly have been more striking. The secretary's fingers were slender and precise, marked by years of typing, filing, and the countless small tasks that required delicate manipulation. Her nails were filed short and practical, perfect for threading wire through fabric or making tiny electrical connections. More tellingly, Mrs. Lane's entire approach to parish administration demonstrated exactly the sort of methodical planning and attention to detail that would have been essential for orchestrating such an elaborate murder. She was, Miss Marple reflected, precisely the sort of person who would think to prepare materials in advance, to arrange events with mathematical precision, and to execute complex plans with domestic efficiency. Organization, she said softly to herself, the word carrying weight far beyond its simple syllables. Inspector Slack was beginning to reach similar conclusions, though his approach was more direct than Miss Marple's subtle observations. The accumulating evidence pointed increasingly towards someone with access, opportunity, and the particular skills necessary for the crime. The electrical expertise, the advanced preparation, the control over the evening's arrangements, all of these requirements pointed toward one person who had been present throughout their investigation, helpful, efficient, and trusted by everyone in St. Mary Mead. The question was no longer who had killed Arthur Penrith, but whether they would be able to prove it convincingly, enough to satisfy a jury of the secretary's peers. Chapter 9. The Check in the Bible. Lady Bantry had always possessed an insatiable curiosity about other people's affairs, a trait that had occasionally proved embarrassing at dinner parties, but which now served the cause of justice admirably. While Inspector Slack continued his methodical examination of the electrical evidence, Dolly had wandered into the small vestry adjoining the parish rooms with the aimless air of someone seeking a moment's respite from the evening's horrors. What she discovered there, tucked between the pages of the large Bible used for administering oaths at trust meetings, provided the final piece of the puzzle that Miss Marple had been carefully assembling. "Jane," she called in a stage whisper that carried clearly across the room, "you really must come and see this." Miss Marple found her old friend standing beside the vestry table, the heavy Bible open before her, and an expression of triumphant discovery illuminating her features. Between the pages of the Book of Psalms lay a folded bank check, its blue paper incongruous against the ancient text. "I was just looking for a bookmark," Dolly explained, with the innocent air of someone who had clearly been doing nothing of the sort. And there it was, bold as brass. The check was made out in Arthur Penrith's careful handwriting, drawn on his personal account at the Midshires Bank. The amount, 25s, was substantial enough to raise questions, but it was the payee line that made Miss Marple's eyebrows rise in genuine surprise. The check was made payable to Arthur Penrith himself. "How very interesting," she murmured, studying the document with careful attention. The date was recent, within the past week, and the notation in the memo line read, "Advance against trust subscriptions." Inspector Slack arrived to examine their discovery with the grim satisfaction of a man whose suspicions were being confirmed by accumulating evidence. "Self-dealing," he muttered, making notes with vigorous strokes of his pencil. "Taking money from the trust account for his own use." Miss Marple was reading the check more carefully, noting details that spoke volumes about Arthur's state of mind in his final days. The handwriting showed signs of stress, slight tremors in letters that were normally perfectly formed, pressure variations that suggested emotional tension. "He was planning something," she observed thoughtfully, This check represents far more than simple embezzlement. The implications were becoming clear as the pieces of Arthur's final scheme fell into place. He had taken money from the trust account, ostensibly as an advance against future subscriptions, but had intended to use tonight's meeting to shift the blame for any financial irregularities onto Mrs. Lane, while simultaneously calling in Paul Cartwright's debt. A calculated betrayal, Miss Marple said softly, her words barely audible even to Lady Bantry. Arthur's plan had been elegantly simple in its malice. By publicly accusing Mrs. Lane of irregular handling of petty cash, while demanding immediate repayment from Cartwright, he would have deflected attention from his own unauthorized borrowing, while settling personal scores with those who had displeased him. Thought he. Check had been hidden in the Bible as insurance, documentary, proof of his own authorized withdrawal. Should anyone question his version of events? In Arthur's mind, it would have served as evidence of his fiscal responsibility, while he destroyed the reputations of those he considered unreliable. Most unpleasant, Dr. Haydock observed, having joined their examination of the evidence, using a public meeting to humiliate people who trusted him. Miss Marple reflected on the psychology that had driven Arthur to such extremes. His reputation for financial propriety had been the cornerstone of his standing in St. Mary Mead society. The discovery that he had been dipping into trust funds, even temporarily, would have destroyed the carefully constructed image he had spent years building. Rather than face exposure, he had chosen to attack first, using his position as treasurer to shift blame onto others. While presenting himself as the guardian of parish finances, it was a strategy that might have succeeded had someone not decided that his truthful statement posed too great a threat to be permitted. Mrs. Lane would have known about the check, Inspector Slack said, his understanding of the case crystallizing. As secretary, she'd have access to all the trust records. Indeed, she would, Miss Marple reflected. Mrs. Lane's efficient administration of parish affairs would have given her intimate knowledge of every financial transaction, including Arthur's unauthorized borrowing. She would have understood immediately what his planned revelations were intended to accomplish: the destruction of her reputation to preserve his own. The evening's agenda took on new significance when viewed in this light. Mrs. Lane had not simply positioned Arthur at the fatal moment through coincidence or routine scheduling. She had deliberately arranged for his accusations to be delivered while he stood at the brass crank, transforming his moment of intended triumph into the precise instant of his destruction. She rewrote the order of battle, Miss Marple murmured, borrowing a phrase from military strategy that seemed peculiarly appropriate to the circumstances. The premeditation evident in every aspect of the murder was becoming more impressive with each revelation. Mrs. Lane had not acted in sudden panic or desperate improvisation. She had learned of Arthur's intentions, assessed the threat to her position, and methodically planned a response that would eliminate both the accuser and his accusations in a single, carefully orchestrated event. The hidden check revealed the depth of Arthur's hypocrisy and provided the motive that had driven someone to such elaborate revenge. Mrs. Lane had trusted Arthur's integrity, had worked faithfully in service to the parish, only to discover that he planned to destroy her reputation to cover his own financial improprieties. Betray, Miss Marple said again, the word carrying weight that encompassed both Arthur's planned treachery and the murderous response it had provoked. Inspector Slack was studying the check with growing understanding of its significance, evidence of his own guilt. Hidden away while he prepared to accuse others, makes the motive crystal clear. The evening's tragedy was taking on the dimensions of a morality play, with themes of trust violated and justice perverted by those who should have been its guardians. Arthur had planned to use his position of authority to destroy innocent people, while his intended victim had responded with a justice of her own devising. Miss Marple found herself thinking of the domestic nature of the crime once again. The murder weapon had been assembled from household materials: copper wire, salt water, florist supplies. The method had exploited domestic knowledge of electrical safety. Even the motive had roots in the sort of personal betrayal that poisoned relationships within small communities. It was, she concluded, a most feminine sort of revenge, planned with the same attention to detail that characterized the best household management, executed with the skills learned through years of domestic responsibility, and motivated by the particular fury that came from discovering that one's trust and loyalty had been cynically exploited. The question that remained was whether Inspector Slack would recognize the significance of all they had discovered, or whether the case would require more direct intervention to ensure that justice was properly served. In Miss Marple's experience, the most dangerous criminals were often those who appeared most respectable, most helpful, most indispensable to their communities. They were the people who held positions of trust, who knew everyone's business, who could move freely through familiar spaces without arousing the slightest suspicion. People exactly like the honorary secretary of the St. Mary Mead Village Trust. Chapter 10. Parish Rooms. Live to the drum. The moment had arrived for Miss Marple to demonstrate the truth that lay hidden beneath the evening's tragedy. With Inspector Slack's grudging permission, she positioned herself on the platform where Arthur Penrith had met his end, her slight figure dwarfed by the brass raffle drum that had served as the instrument of his destruction. "If I may," she began in her gentle voice, addressing the assembled company with a quiet authority that came from absolute certainty, "I should like to explain exactly how poor Arthur was murdered. Tonight." The parish rooms had grown quiet, the earlier pandemonium, replaced by the tense expectation that accompanies the revelation of long-hidden secrets. Even Mrs. Lane, who had maintained her composed efficiency throughout the investigation, stood motionless behind the green baize table, her hands clasped tightly before her. The method was both ingenious and domestic in its conception, Miss Marple continued, her fingers tracing the path of the hidden wire they had discovered in the bunting. "Our murderer stitched a hair-fine copper wire inside this decorative fabric, taking one end once around the brass crank spindle beneath this adjustment nut." She indicated the point where the wire made contact with the raffle drum's mechanism, though she was careful not to touch the metal herself. The evidence of the electrical connection was still visible to those who knew where to look. The other end was carried to the radiator valve, where it was secured with florist's wire of the sort found in Mrs. Lane's electrical supplies. The green verdigris on that connection proves that electrical current flowed through the circuit quite recently. Dr. Haydock nodded confirmation of the technical details, while Inspector Slack made careful notes of her demonstration. "But the electrical connection alone would not have been sufficient," Miss Marple continued, moving to examine the area around the table legs. "Our murderer also dampened the floor with a solution of salt and washing soda, carried in that galvanized bucket, which Mrs. Tripp correctly identified as not belonging to her usual equipment." She gestured toward the offending pail, which stood as mute testimony to the careful preparation that had preceded Arthur's death. The salt residue was still visible on the linoleum, glittering faintly in the harsh electric light. The coconut matting was laid to conceal the tide mark left by the salt water, though traces remained visible to careful observation. When Arthur grasped the crank handle with his perspiring hand, wearing that heavy signet ring, the electrical circuit was completed through his body and the damp leather of his shoes to the salt solution on the floor, then to the radiator earth connection. The mechanical precision of the murder method was becoming clear to everyone present. What had appeared to be a simple heart attack during a moment of excitement had actually been a carefully orchestrated electrocution, timed to coincide with Arthur's planned moment of public triumph. The fairy lights provided perfect cover for the electrical preparations, Miss Marple observed, indicating the dark bulbs that hung so decoratively above the platform. Anyone seeing wirework being done would naturally assume it related to the Christmas decorations. Most clever, really. She paused to allow the implications to settle before continuing with the more complex question of motive and opportunity. The question then becomes, who possessed the knowledge, access, and motive necessary for such an elaborate crime? Let us consider our suspects systematically. Victor Dale shifted uncomfortably as Miss Marple's gaze fell upon him, though her tone remained gentle and non-accusatory. Young Mr. Dale was loudly present at the football supper throughout the relevant period, with half the village able to vouch for his whereabouts. More significantly, his professional assessment of the wirework was most illuminating. He called the copper strand silly thin stuff, unsuitable for Maine's electrical work. A trained electrician would never have chosen such materials for carrying dangerous current. Victor's relief was palpable as suspicion moved away from him toward other possibilities. Mr. Cartwright certainly had financial motive, Miss Marple continued, studying the publican's anxious features. Arthur's planned revelations about that $50 loan would have been most embarrassing. However, Mr. Cartwright's hands tell a different story. She indicated Paul's large, work-hardened hands with their telltale stains of beerstone and kitchen grease. These are hands shaped by years of practical labor, drawing pints, moving barrels, handling the robust equipment of public house management. They show no evidence of the delicate needlework required to stitch hair-fine wire into bunting with such precision, nor the careful planning needed to coordinate multiple elements with mathematical timing. Paul Cartwright's bluff features showed a mixture of relief and indignation as he realized the direction of Miss Marple's deductions, which brings us, she said quietly, to the person who possessed every requirement for this crime. Her gaze settled on Mrs. Lane, who had grown very still behind the table, her usual brisk efficiency replaced by watchful tension. Mrs. Lane had the keys to access the parish rooms at any hour. She had control over the evening's agenda, positioning Arthur at the fatal moment precisely when he intended to deliver his accusations. She possessed the electrical supplies found in her key press, including the prepared copper wire with its freshly scraped ends. Inspector Slack was following the logic carefully, his notebook ready to record any confession that might emerge from Miss Marple's methodical presentation. Most damning of all, Miss Marple continued, she had the motive that drove her to such elaborate revenge. Arthur's handwritten notes reveal his intention to publicly accuse her of financial irregularities while concealing his own unauthorized borrowing from the trust account. She held up the check they had discovered in the vestry Bible, its blue paper stark against the evening's accumulated evidence. This check, hidden where only Arthur could retrieve it, represents his own guilt while he prepared to destroy Mrs. Lane's reputation. She would have known of his embezzlement through her secretarial duties, would have understood that his truthful statement was designed to shift blame onto innocent people, while preserving his own carefully constructed image. Mrs. Lane's composed facade was beginning to crack under the weight of accumulating evidence. Her neat gray hair remained perfectly arranged, but her hands had begun to tremble slightly despite her efforts at control. The typing evidence confirms her involvement, Miss Marple observed, indicating the agenda with its distinctive high-writing E. She rewrote the order of proceedings to ensure Arthur would be standing at the drum when he began his accusations. She transformed his moment of intended triumph into the precise instant of his destruction. The silence in the parish rooms had become profound, broken only by the distant sound of evening traffic and the whisper of spring wind against the windows. Confronted with Arthur's planned betrayal, Miss Marple concluded gently, Mrs. Lane chose to respond with a betrayal of her own. She used her position of trust, her access to the building, and her intimate knowledge of parish routines to create the perfect murder weapon from the most domestic of materials. Inspector Slack stepped forward with official gravity, his handcuffs ready despite his obvious reluctance to arrest such a pillar of parish society. "Iris Lane," he began formally, "I arrest you for the murder of Arthur Penrith." The words seemed to break whatever spell had held Mrs. Lane in frozen composure. Her shoulders sagged, and for the first time that evening, her voice lost its crisp efficiency. "He would have made me the lie," she said quietly, the grammatical slip revealing the depth of her emotion. "After everything I did for that trust, all those years of faithful service, he would have destroyed my reputation to save his own." Inspector Slack took her arm with surprising gentleness, recognizing the tragedy that had unfolded beneath the surface of parish respectability. Later, in the blessed quiet of Lady Bantry's drawing room, Miss Marple accepted a cup of tea with the gratitude of someone who had seen too much of human frailty for one evening. "A village runs on trust," Dolly sighed, echoing the themes that had shaped the night's events. Miss Marple folded her knitting with the precise movements that had become second nature over decades of contemplation and observation. "Yes, my dear Anon habits, people betray themselves through the smallest details, the way they label a box, stitch a hem, or arrange an agenda. In the end, lies reveal themselves, and even the most carefully hidden wires cannot help but hum with the current of truth.